Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Bird's Nest Podcast. I'm Joe Donahue. Thank you so much for joining us. The NFL draft is just a few weeks away, and it's time to make sure that we, as Eagles fans, are earnestly looking at this draft. The Philadelphia Eagles have 3 picks in the first 2 rounds, and then they have 5 picks on day 3. 1 coming in round 4, 3 coming in round 5, and 1 coming in round 6. And that's all presuming that Howie doesn't do as he's known to do and trade up and down the board. Howie hasn't had a draft where he hasn't made any day of draft trades. He hasn't made any kind of moves to try to get players. In fact, the only time since Howie Roseman became the GM that the Philadelphia Eagles didn't do any up and down the board draft trading was in 2015, and that was because Howie didn't have the personnel. That was the responsibility of Chip Kelly. So it's important to take a look at potential draft strategies, and I do think the Eagles will probably make some trades, but it's not something that I'm going to factor in for this episode. Because realistically, we're just kind of looking at it right now in terms of blocks. Where do you think that the Eagles are going to pick within that first or second round? And then what do we think as we get into the later rounds? That's really the approach I'm taking at this point. I'm not heart and sold on particular picks because at this point, we don't know how he's got going when he's chatting with other GMs and other teams trying to make those decisions. So while I fully expect there to be trades, I'm putting that possibility aside for the time being. We'll get there. There will be an opportunity for that. So what do we look at in terms of strategy? Well, a lot of focus is going to be on the top 3 picks, but I will touch on things to look at later on. And right now, for those top 3 picks, the Eagles are almost universally mocked to be picking a corner with that first pick. Whether it's somebody like Cooper DeJean, who has met with the Eagles, whether it's somebody like Nate Wiggins, who's probably a bit more realistic, but the Eagles' corner position, along with the entirety of the secondary, has needed significant improvement. And even if the NFL didn't invite many of them to the draft, some of the top prospects in this draft are corners. Now, that having been said, there is some potential dissonance. The Eagles typically work from the lines out. They typically try to fill needs at the lines before they look for things that would be going on in either backfield. And this was dissonance that I had the opportunity to ask Mel Kiper Jr., a senior draft analyst for ESPN, and basically he said that the Eagles are going to have to buck that trend this year, given the fact that it's just too important.
Okay, as far as the Eagles go, in terms of the cornerback position, I just feel like you have to address it. I mean, to me, it's not, you can't wait on it necessarily when it's that big a need. When it's that, and it does have to work in unison with what's available. Is there a guy worthy of being that high a pick? And I think the corners that we talked about are worthy of being that high a choice.
Now, those who are not mocking the Eagles taking a corner in the first round have the Eagles taking an offensive lineman like Tyler Guyton. This is a relatively important need for the Eagles. If the Eagles go in that direction, it would be consistent with their history. And it's a need because the Eagles don't have a ton of line depth. Jason Kelce has left. Cam Jurgens is probably going to get slotted into the center spot. All that having been said, I do think defense is the more pressing need. And my gut is telling me right now that the Eagles will probably be going defense in that first round. I don't have any hard evidence to back it up, but the gut sense is that the organization's reaction to the 1-6 finish over the course of the last 7 games is going to be trying to address what happened in the defense. The Eagles did get some help in free agency with C.J. Gardner-Johnson, but the defensive secondary, that's an area that needs immediate attention for this team. And also, you got to factor in the fact that most of the Eagles' offensive needs, maybe except for getting some extra depth on the line, have been addressed for the most part. I also caught up with another draft analyst from ESPN, Field Yates, and it seemed to him the defense was such a pressing need that when he released his mock draft a couple of weeks ago, he had the Eagles going all defense with their first 3 picks. Most recently, he had the Eagles picking Nate Wiggins at corner, Peyton Wilson at linebacker, and Cole Bishop at safety, respectively. I asked him about these guys schematically fitting in with Vic Fangio's defense, but for him, it wasn't so much about the schematic part of it as it was about the fact that, honestly, the Eagles needed fundamental athleticism in the secondary.
So the scheme matters to me. Vic Fangio, I think when I think of a Vic Fangio defense, most important thing that I think of is the elimination of big plays. It's going to make you work they're going to make you work short to long. Like you're not going to necessarily get those easy shots. You're going to get a lot of, if you score on Vic Fangio defense, it's going to be grinding things out. But for Philly and the players that I picked, some of it was the scheme, but some of it, truthfully, Joe, was just like the overall athleticism on this defense right now, where it needs to be going forward. And I'm not trying to overreact entirely to what happened at the end of last season, but the secondary really, really needs an infusion of some speed. So that's why I ended up with Nate Wiggins and also Cole Bishop. Wiggins was the fastest corner in the entire combine. Bishop, one of the fastest safeties in the entire combine. Bishop also has some man coverage skills, an excellent blitzer as well. So while the team, of course, did bring back CJ Gardner-Johnson, a lot of depth there would be important for Philadelphia going forward. And then Peyton Wilson. People are probably saying the Eagles never drafted a linebacker early. That's true, but I also thought that the Eagles would never pay a running back. And they did that with Saquon Barkley, one of the biggest contracts for a running back over the past 2 or 3 years. So I'm thinking of this might be a little bit of a changing of the guard. And Peyton Wilson's versatility is off the charts. He is an incredible inside linebacker who also played on the edge occasionally for NC State. If you go back and watch any of his 6 sacks this past year, each one of them, the speed that he possesses shows off. And that speed was on display at the combine as well. He's got both a shoulder and knee injury on the ledger that need to be examined very closely. That's why he slid to the sort of mid to late portion of the second round for me. I think the tape is like top 30 to 35-ish overall player for Peyton Wilson. But yeah, Philly, I think it's got to be a defensive-minded and oriented draft and an athleticism-minded and oriented draft. And of course, because of the Eagles, the possibility of an offensive tackle is always in play.
For what it's worth, Mel Kiper was also pretty high on Nate Wiggins.
So, I think the corner is such a key need. A guy who has recovery speed is a guy like Wiggins. He ran 4.28. He's added some weight since the combine when he was 173 pounds. He finished his career strong after having some struggles early on.
So you could go all defense, and that would be a strategy that I honestly would be very happy with. And I think a lot of Eagles fans out there would be very happy if the Eagles went and they addressed those defensive needs with those first 3 picks of the draft, wherever they wind up actually falling. But I will say this. If the Eagles take just one of those picks and use it to address offensive line, I would be content with that. While I was with Mel, he offered some insights on that offensive line pick, depending on whether or not the Eagles used it in the first round or the second round. Some players that might be worth considering.
It's really, that's a flip. You can go either way on that. I went to cornerback first and then the offensive lineman. If you want to just look at what the options would be, if you don't go, say, Wiggins and then say Patrick Paul, and then of course I got a receiver there with Polk as well. If you want to go the opposite way and say offensive line early, it would be the guys I've discussed, the Mims, Guyton, players like that. I don't know Fashanu, how far he falls, but that would be some of your options there. I don't think Troy Fautanu from Washington will be there. I think he goes very early, at the worst in the mid-first round. I think corner maybe, and then work on the offensive lineman. And the one other offensive lineman, Kingsley Suamataia, he could still be there. I discussed him in the early to mid-second, have him in the late second. There's a wide range of opinion on him. He's super talented, needs some coaching, needs to fine tune some things, but he's a guy you could look at as well. And you want that guy with versatility that can play with various hats, guard, tackle. If you want that kind of guy, maybe Cooper Beebe from Kansas State, who I gave to Baltimore, could be that type of player.
But for me, the way that I look at it is this. With those first picks, with those first round picks, the second round picks, you want to make sure that you're drafting players that have the potential to impact the team immediately. They're able to jump right in on the field. Look at what the Eagles did with Jalen Carter this year. The Eagles were able to get him right out on the field. He played a boatload of snaps for the defense. He was an impact player. He made the Eagles' defensive line felt that much more. The Eagles didn't have that quite as much with Nolan Smith. He was a pretty solid special teams player. That's where most of his snaps were, though. He spent more of his snaps in special teams than he did in the defensive backfield. So while it's important for a draft prospect to be able to learn from veterans and to be able to have some time to that, if you're going to take a player early, my expectation is that that player is going to have some degree of an impact over the course of the season relatively immediately. Now, Field Yates also had some thoughts about how the Eagles' draft strategy was impacted by the Hassan Reddick trade. The Eagles did trade Hassan Reddick to the Jets for a conditional third-round pick in 2026. It could become a second-round pick. The Eagles simply weren't going to pay Reddick what he was looking for. He was looking to get paid for past performance, so the Eagles traded him off to the Jets. And there was definitely initial negative reaction in the city of Philadelphia, and I totally get it. I was not thrilled when I heard about the terms as well initially, but you have to take a step back and you have to look at the whole picture. And what the Eagles kind of did was effectuated a trade. The Eagles traded away Hassan Reddick, really for Bryce Huff. And that was something that Field Yates mentioned, that because that happened, they're actually in a better spot at edge than they could have been if the Bryce Huff acquisition hadn't happened.
So it's not often that a major trade like moving on from Hassan Reddick results in sort of a minor ripple effect, but it kind of feels like that's the case for Philly, right? Because they had already kind of replaced Hassan Reddick before they actually traded Hassan Reddick with the signing of Bryce Huff. So it feels like Philly kind of knew that one was coming down the pike a while ago. So I suppose it beefs up their need for a bit more edge depth. If they had also moved on from Josh Sweat, though, I think it would have become a real need. But given the fact that they now have they have Bryce Huff, they also have one of their two first round picks in Nolan Smith, and also Josh Sweat. Like that to me is a pretty darn good starting point for an edge group in a league where it's really hard to find players at that position.
So I would be content with the Eagles going offensive line with one of their top three, as long as the other two are defensive picks. Now, I had the chance to ask Mel Kiper for some day 3 pick ideas that would interest him for the Eagles. He had this to say.
Elijah Jones is a kid out of Boston College on day 3 who's got length, had 7 interceptions the last 2 years, broke up 14, 15 passes, tested really well with that 42.5 vertical. So Elijah Jones is one. I mentioned Drew Phillips from Kentucky. Jarvis Brownlee Jr. out of Louisville. A kid out of the CFL, Quantez Stiggers, I think would certainly make sense on day 3. Coming in from the CFL, it was Toronto Argonauts. He was a CFL Rookie of the Year. Wide receivers on day 3. I'll tell you what. Where does Anthony Gould come off the board out of Oregon State? Nice player. Really good player. I like them. Xavier Weaver out of Colorado in day 3. Javon Baker out of UCF. I think will be a good day 3 pick as well. If you look at another possibility on day, I'd say 3rd round, a kid I love, very underrated player, Bub Means from Pitt. Had a heck of a career at Pitt after coming from Louisiana Tech. Averaged 18 yards a catch. He's big. He's got length, physicality, big hands, strong hands. I like Bub Means out of Pitt.
And somebody else that could make a day 3 impact, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. He has been a name that has been on many Eagles fans' mouths. We've talked about him before a little bit on this podcast. Field Yates thinks that he would be a solid day 3 pick for the Eagles.
I think Jeremiah Trotter Jr. is a day 3 pick. I love watching Jeremiah Trotter Jr. play. As far as all the linebackers in the class, he and Peyton Wilson, to me, felt like sort of the purest line-backing players at that entire position, if that makes sense. Like, they know what they're doing. They know where they're supposed to be. They know how to get there as well as anybody in the class. Here's the question that Jeremiah Trotter Jr. is going to have to we're going to have to find out the answer to. How many teams are going to draft a player that size? He's an undersized linebacker. There are some teams that play systems where it sort of fits ideally. You know, I think about the Bills as a good example of a team that has made very good use of undersized linebackers. Matt Milano has become an excellent player for them. The Browns struck gold with Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah from Notre Dame a couple of years ago in the second round as well. But you've got teams that are looking for 240 or 6'2", 240-pound linebackers. So I think Jeremiah Trotter Jr.'s football ability is probably better than day three might suggest. I just, I tend to defer to like history when I'm trying to find exactly where to place players like that. And it seems to me that the NFL probably defers more towards the bigger, bulkier linebackers.
But we have an important thing to note here, and that is that the Eagles are still honing their strategy, just like every other GM that's out there. Diana Rossini of The Athletic reminded us of this. It's important to bear that in mind, but the Eagles do have to put Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni up in front of the media over the course of the next couple weeks in advance of the draft. So we may hear more from them, and we may get a little bit more insight into what that draft strategy is going to look like. We'll see how that pans out. But for now, again, the strategy that I think is we should be going defense for the first 3 picks. I would be content if we swapped out one of those first 3 for offensive line. Doesn't really matter which one. Take your pick. For the day 3 picks that the Eagles have in rounds 4, 5, and 6, again, all of this is presuming no trades. I would be relatively content with the Eagles just trying to find the best players out there, trying to address some of those down roster needs, maybe getting some extra guys in there who could be replacing folks like, say, Brandon Graham, who's going to be retiring at the end of this year. He's made that crystal clear. A wide receiver who could be filling in the slot position, starting to learn from some of those guys. The Eagles could even go tight end, start looking for who's going to replace Dallas Goedert. But I don't think that those needs should be addressed until day 3. The pressing needs are the needs that need to be attacked now, and those would be pretty much the secondary, maybe an offensive lineman thrown in there. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Who do you think the Eagles should be targeting with their top 3 picks? Are there any players that excite you? What are your thoughts about how the Eagles should utilize their day 3 picks? Let me know. And thank you so much to everybody for tuning into the Bird's Nest Podcast. You can support the Bird's Nest Podcast by liking and subscribing to Bird's Nest Media right here on YouTube, and by sharing to your social media pages. You can also find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play Music, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, and the Odyssey app. Please visit birdsnestmedia.com for additional Eagles coverage. And if you feel so inclined to support us in a different way, you can find the link to our Patreon in the description below, or at birdsnestmedia.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's go Eagles.